Education choice has exploded in popularity across America in recent years. So why does it remain a contentious debate in some states?
School choice, the impulses for that are primarily parental driven. And it's a view that education is fundamentally about educating the child.
We sit down with a couple of experts in two different states to compare notes on different approaches to education choice policy and equip you with a better way to respond when criticisms arise. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about education choice. It's become a topic that has gotten a lot of attention across the nation, and of course here in Utah and some other states, as we'll learn more about as we talk with one of our guests today. We're also going to dive into why there's some controversy around it, what are some of the disagreements, and how we should be thinking about and talking about education choice as a policy mechanism to help prepare the next generation. I'm pleased to welcome our guests today, the first of which is Bob Luebke. He's the director for the Center of Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina. Bob, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be here, Nick.
And also we're joined once again by Cooke Fairbanks, who's the Education Policy Fellow for us here at Sutherland Institute. Christine, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
I'm grateful to both of you for sharing some of your time and expertise with us, because it just in recent years, this idea of education choice, of putting more power in the hands of parents, of families, to have greater control and influence over how and where and in what way their children are learning, has exploded on the national scene in recent years. And I want to dive into some of that, and particularly with our two states, with Utah and North Carolina. This issue has been moving forward in some pretty significant ways, and it's also at times caused some debate and discussion, which is, of course, a healthy thing in a constitutional republic like ours. But I want to dive into those dynamics of this issue and equip our listeners with a better approach to this issue so they can have more elevated conversations. And to start off, I want to mention that one of the state representatives here in Utah, Representative Candace Pierucci, who's the chair of the House Education Committee and also was the sponsor for the Utah Education Choice Bill in the last session where it passed. It's called the Utah Fits All Scholarship. She posted on Twitter, formerly X, that the application window for that program had recently closed, and there were more than 27,000 children whose families had applied for this program. So obviously a lot of interest here in Utah. With all of that big lead up, I want to start by talking about your state, Bob, in the state of North Carolina, and use that as kind of our lead, because your governor there has kind of been running the circuit, having some things to say about the education choice issue. So first, can you give us a quick check-in on what's the status of education choice in North Carolina? What has the governor there been saying that we need to know about?
Well, thank you, Nick. I'd say our governor has been anti-choice, anti-school choice his whole term. He has opposed three of the existing programs that we have in school choice, actually two of the existing programs. And your listeners might have been familiar that last year he declared a public school emergency, which pretty much coincided with the introduction of a bill to universalize a voucher program in North Carolina, which subsequently passed over the governor's veto. So he's been very adamant about opposing school choice. His reasoning when he talks about it is primarily twofold: that it hurts public schools, and that it lacks accountability. He doesn't get at all into the actual parental rights issue, which we find interesting. But he tries to basically say it costs public schools money, and the schools that currently enroll opportunity scholarship recipients lack accountability. Now, we've responded to those concerns numerous times and believe that we have strong arguments against them. But his opposition, which has been vocal, is primarily along those two lines.
Bob, can you articulate what are the counterarguments when our listeners hear someone, whether it's the governor of North Carolina, whether it's others who make those claims, who say that a school choice approach, a school choice system, is bad for public schools and it doesn't have adequate accountability? What are the counterarguments that you've been making in North Carolina that you think could be persuasive for other persuadable voters who might be hearing about this debate?
Sure. Simply put, the governor says it really hurts schools financially. If you look at the data on that, just simple looks at per pupil expenditures. For example, over the life of the Opportunity Scholarship Program, say if you went from 2014, which is when our program started here, until 2022, say you do just the last 10 years, our per pupil expenditures for public schools have actually gone up from $8,400 to over $12,000, about $12,600. So that's a significant increase. It's hard to make the case that public schools are hurting when you have that kind of jump in per pupil expenditures. If you put that in inflation adjusted dollars, it actually went up about 14% over the last 10 years. So is it damaging public schools? It's a hard case to make when you actually look at the dollar numbers. Again, over the over the years of the program, 2014 to 2022, public school budgets have gone up from about $7 billion to $10 billion. Again, that directly contradicts, the governor's comments on that subject. The other area with regards to accountability, he said Opportunity Scholarship schools lack accountability. That's simply not true. They still are subject to the same safety, health, and non-discrimination regulations that public schools are subject to. If schools enroll 70 students, they have to employ a certified public accountant and do a financial audit every year. And also, schools that enroll any students have to provide a academic progress report to the parents, and the students have to have take every year a national standardized test to see just where they are progressing academically. So, the comments from the governor with regards to no accountability simply aren't true. If he really believed that, we'd have to ask the governor why he enrolled one of his daughters in a private school himself. So, the comments are easily rebuttable from our end, and actually we do monthly polling on a variety of issues. A lot of times those issues are on school choice, and for the last several years, both of our programs, the Opportunity Scholarship Program and charter schools, which we have about 206 charter schools in North Carolina now, but both of those programs enjoy support in the mid-60s, which is very high, and it's been consistently that high for a while. So my take from that is the governor's comments with regards to OSP, Opportunity Scholarship Program, lacking accountability and really taking public school dollars. They really aren't taking or gaining traction with the public.
Christine, how does that track with what we've seen here in Utah, with the debates and discussions over different approaches to education choice? Is it a lot of the same questions or critiques that Bob articulated in North Carolina or elsewhere, or how has the debate been different in Utah? What is the nature of how this issue has progressed here in Utah?
Ultimately, yes, the issues that he mentioned, they are common across most states that are trying to pursue education choice, which is that you're going to drain funds from public schools and that there is this movement to destroy public education, which I just don't think has necessarily caught on in a way that would actually block education choice from moving forward. And I don't think it reflects reality either. The vast majority of students still go to public schools. A common talking point against that would be, if you remove certain resources from a school, well, you've also removed the student who might have been using up those resources from that school. So I think that, there is this common drumbeat about funding, but I'm not sure that it's really kind of played out. In Utah specifically, there was this discussion about the Utah Fits All scholarship. It was also kind of a small drop in the bucket, right? Originally, it could only cover 5,000 students. Obviously, that got expanded, but it just the idea was that this was not going to be a substantial threat to public schools. As far as accountability goes, yes, that is another very common talking point, and I think that you have to kind of piece apart accountability and what you mean by that. So there is financial accountability to taxpayers, and that's absolutely something we need and want to look at. And then there's sort of this academic student growth accountability. How is that student actually doing? And some people will argue that lands with the parent ultimately. And that's true even if they delegate teaching authority to a public school teacher and say, hey, you teach them. Ultimately, if the student's not thriving or they are having significant gaps in their education, that's something that the parent needs to be aware of and make different choices from there. And we can address too that the Utah Fits All scholarship does seek to address accountability in these different forms. But in Utah, there were a couple of specific things as well. In 2007, there was a bill passed, a universal voucher, and then there was a huge campaign to defeat that, and then it was killed in referendum. So the talking point there was, hey, Utahns have already spoken on this issue and they don't want it. Okay, but there's been a lot of time that's passed since 2007, and there's also been a pandemic, so things are not the same as they were in 2007. So to say they've already spoken on this issue probably just doesn't cover what people are actually concerned about and thinking about here. So that I would say what Dr. Luebke is experiencing is probably pretty common across the board too.
Is that kind of how it's been in North Carolina? And to Christine's point of when people throw around the term accountability, we have to drill down to what they actually mean. Is it just tracking the dollars expended to make sure that they're expended legally and ethically and all those kinds of things? Or is it something deeper that is there a concern among the critics of education choice that, well, if folks are going to these other, just different models of learning, their academic outcomes just won't be as good? So is it kind of that approach? Like what do you think is driving the accountability critique?
The more I've observed this, the more I see that the opposing camps here are fundamentally in two different worlds. What do I mean by that? Governor Cooper is really defending a system, and he views his job as to make sure the public schools have sufficient resources and, to protect the system. School choice, the impulses for that are primarily parental driven. And it's a view that education is fundamentally about educating the child. That's not I wouldn't say it's not the concern, but it's not the fundamental concern of the governor. And he has said pretty much as much. His concern is protecting the health and viability of the system. Now that reflects hugely diverging viewpoints on what the issue is here. Now, when you talk about accountability, Christine was right. There are various facets to that. Governmental accountability, involves making sure that dollars expended, are meeting certain programmatic goals. Okay, and how do recipients in the Opportunity Scholarship Program do that? I mentioned the regulations for that before, but parents involved in that program pretty much are of the belief, okay, we are responsible for the moral and educational upbringing of our kids. Yeah, we'll take a national standardized test to show where where the students are with regards to academic progress, and we're fine with making sure that the dollars received by these programs are audited when need be, et cetera. But they're much more hands-off because they believe, with regards to accountability, they're fundamentally responsible for the education of that child. And that's where the accountability is. So they view it fundamentally different. Now, obviously, from a public policy perspective, there has to be give on some of that to make sure that the expenditures of dollars, do meet program goals, et cetera. And there's also has to be respect because the Supreme Court, in a case almost 100 years ago, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which I'm sure Christine is familiar with, really upheld the notion that parents are ultimately responsible for the moral and educational development of their children. And a lot of these programs are rooted, in that ruling.
Can we dive into that for a minute, Bob? Because it's an interesting point that's come up a lot in the work, Christine, that you've done here in Utah and a lot of the conversations across the nation about education, that do we sort of need a recentering of education to say that, look, its purpose is, to use some language that you've written, Christine, this idea of a handshake between parents and teachers, that it's not just, well, it's up to the experts in the education field alone, and no one else can have any say. It really is supposed to be this idea of a partnership, that parents are the ones who are, as you said, Bob, chiefly responsible, but they essentially engage in this partnership with teachers, with whatever education environment that is that they choose, to then work together in a collaborative way for the education of children. Does it seem like, maybe you first, Bob, and then Christine, your thoughts, but does it seem like that principle is lacking in North Carolina? And Christine, do you see that lacking elsewhere as well? Do we need to elevate that idea?
Yeah, I think recentering or resetting is a good term for it. The pandemic did in 2 years what the school choice movement, had a hard time doing in 20, in that it really supercharged the topic. It gave parents kind of a view, behind the classroom walls, and what was actually going on. And I'm not going to generalize it was all teachers, but we all know that there's been a great increase in the number of teachers who, enter the classroom with activist agendas. And that's not supposed to be like that. And so that's propelled a lot of choice. A lot of teachers still think, and rightfully so, that education is a partnership with parents. And I think most parents would agree with that. But still, when push comes to shove, the teachers work for the parents because the parents pay the bills.
Christine, how central do you see that idea as being necessary to, I guess, re-inject back into this state and national dialogue on education, this idea of elevating the parent-teacher partnership, the handshake? Is that lacking and still in a lot of our conversations about education?
Yes, and the handshake concept comes from Rick Hess at AEI, and so I've written about kind of the partnership principle from that as well. But yes, definitely, I think there's sort of this default of the public schools is where you send your kids, and that's probably, practically speaking, the reality. But it's really a choice among many, ultimately, for parents. They don't have to necessarily send their child there. But when they do, there has to be a partnership. A parent can send their child to a school, but that doesn't mean that they abdicate their responsibility as a parent to that child and to understand where they're at in their learning, and they need to be partners in that. I will say, the discussion about parents and having this sort of academic accountability is, fundamentally a different way of looking at education and the purpose of it, and sort of just even this character development of the human being. Parents have high hopes and ideals for their students and for their children, and that comes that can be achieved in a lot of different ways in a lot of different education environments. And this doesn't take away from, we were talking about this earlier, this doesn't take away from accountability to the state in some reason. So taxpayer funding is sacred in a sense, and we do owe some accountability there as well. But that can be achieved through audits, making sure that students in Utah, there's not a warm feeling towards testing, right? So the Utah Fits All Scholarship did not require testing, but they required either a portfolio or norm reference test. So some way of checking in and showing that the student is achieving something. There's even income priorities for the scholarship. So low-income students, then a bigger chunk, and then everybody finally can access the scholarship. And that way we're saying, hey, those who need it most get the taxpayer funding to get these sort of opportunities. And I think that's another way of getting at accountability there. So parents are the drivers of education. They have a fundamental right to do that, but that doesn't take away from other pieces of accountability, which I think can be very well addressed, notwithstanding education choice policies.
Christine, that's a good segue into a question I want to ask, and I want to try and get it in before we go to a quick break here in a minute. But as you talk about the Utah Fits All Scholarship, about some of these measures, as you articulate, that are, maybe the way we're thinking about accountability might be different than what they're approaching in North Carolina. But I wanted to dial down to Bob asking you, our Utah Fits All Scholarship here in Utah is still new, of course. But in North Carolina, you guys have had a number of programs that have been on the books for a long time. What's the best success story? What's the best example of, here's an example of a program or an option that's in the context of education choice, and it's worked really well, and parents like it, and it has good outcomes and good accountability. What's like the best gold standard, if you will, for you guys in North Carolina that you can point to that say that this shows that education choice is a really good thing?
Well, we have two programs currently, and I think both programs are good. No program's perfect. I mean, we're still tinkering around with accountability on the Opportunity Scholarship Program, on what the best metrics or options are on that. But I think we have in 2017, we passed a special needs ESA program, which has exploded, now has about 3,400 recipients. And it's very popular. It provides parents the opportunity to potentially get up to $17,000 a year, depending upon the severity of the disability. But I've seen letters and testimonies from parents who have said it's changed their child's life. And the advantage, as we all know, of an ESA is it allows a parent to tailor the educational experience for that child and the needs of special needs children. The educational needs of special needs children are much different than the needs of traditional children. So that is working very well, as is indicative of the enrollment numbers, the increase in enrollment. We universalized our Opportunity Scholarship Program this past year. We had the month of March to accept new applications into the system. When it closed, there were 72,000 new applications. That's a successful program, despite what a lot of people say, the conventional criticisms of voucher programs. But each year we have school choice luncheon, we have conferences and so forth. Many of the times we bring up parents who have participated in the program and students, and they provide testimonies as to how their child's life has been changed by being able to go to a good school. Now, I'm not disparaging public schools at all in this. The reality is not all schools fit all students. And that's all we're trying to assert, is that parents should have the right to put their child in a school that's the best fit for them. And as I said before, each of those programs have support numbers in the mid-60s, which is very high for polling. So I think both of those are successful. They've been tested as far as parental satisfaction. We've had the special needs program. That's a different metric, but by and large, parents like it, and what we're getting back as far as the academic progress of students, I mean, they're where they're supposed to be.
When we come back, Bob and Christina, I want to dive into a little bit more, Christina in particular, the way the Utah Fits All Scholarship came about and was passed here in Utah. It was a little bit unique compared to a lot of states. And so I want to dive into that and see if maybe that can in some way inform some of these discussions in other states in a way that's helpful, and also talk about what's next. You know, what else do you both see, either in terms of education choice or even just broader education reforms, do you think will help make the systems in our two states and across the nation be better equipped to prepare the next generation for what they need as they become adults? So I want to get into all that after a quick break. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue the conversation about education policy, specifically education choice, some programs that have been put in place here in Utah and in North Carolina with our other guests that we're talking to today. But before we continue the conversation, I want to mention, if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, wherever you like to listen to your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click that subscribe button. You can also watch full episodes on YouTube at the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel, or you can also find short clips from this and previous episodes that you can use in your conversations and that you can share on social media. That's defendingideas.org. So to continue the conversation, we've been talking with Bob Luebke, who's the director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina, and Christine Cooke Fairbanks, who's the Education Policy Fellow for us here at Sutherland. I want to continue where we left off, and Christine, start with you specifically. The way that Utah advanced its education program, the Utah Fits All Scholarship, is maybe a little bit unique compared to some other states in the way it tried to sort of balance this idea of supporting education choice, but still supporting the traditional school system. Can you give us some context there and maybe articulate why that was actually really successful and impactful here in Utah?
Yeah, so a little bit of background could be helpful too. Utah has passed education choice legislation in the past. So in 2005, they passed a traditional voucher for special needs students called the Carson Smith Scholarship. Then I mentioned in 2007, they tried to have a universal voucher. That went up in flames, so to speak. Then in 2020, there was this movement now to sort of have an a la carte or wider variety approach to choice. And so then in 2020 passed the tax credit scholarship for students with special needs. And then we kind of landed after the pandemic. So there was a strong interest in passing school choice. And our Governor Spencer Cox, is a proponent of school choice, supports it. But he did signal that he didn't want to move forward unless we were also addressing teachers and the issues that were plaguing them, including and specifically salary raises. Just the year prior, the lead sponsor on the Utah Fits All Scholarship had run a bill similar to it, but called it the Hope Scholarship. And she said, I didn't want to call it that, again, because I didn't want to send the message that leaving public schools was the only hope that they had, right? You know, she said, I believe in the public school system as well, but every child is different and we need as many choices as possible to meet them. All right, so then in 2023, that is what happened is we, press forward with the Utah Fits All. It's a universal bill. It's an education savings account, not a voucher. And it paired it directly with increases for teacher salary or compensation packages. And that ultimately passed, and it passed pretty quickly. It came out of the gates and was all wrapped up in a couple of weeks. So there was some political strategy in that as well. But pairing those two things together was, I think, probably the secret to the success. To some who opposed the education choice scholarship, they said it felt disingenuous, right? You're trying to kind of bait in teachers with this. But others, I think, would say that, hey, this is a holistic approach to saying we support all forms of education, and we want to make sure that we do that in this bill. We're not trying to leave one segment behind by advancing another. So that is, Utah's approach. Utah also has a track record of trying to bring together stakeholders that don't normally agree and trying to pass legislation that has a compromise in it. And that was definitely reflected in this bill.
Bob, do you think that's a way to make this issue feel less adversarial, whether in North Carolina or elsewhere? Is that a principle that's been deployed where you are or in other states that you've seen? And if not, should it be more widespread? Should we adopt more generally this idea of both parts of this overall system of how we educate our kids are valuable and are worthy of support, and it should all be considered one part of just this bigger effort to educate the next generation? Is that a principle that you think it has been deployed effectively, or should it be in North Carolina or elsewhere?
I think it's generally effective in the long term. Each state has its own political culture. The choice legislation in North Carolina that's been advanced in the last several years has been done by Republicans who have either done it in the budget bill or overridden a gubernatorial veto because they had supermajorities. So the bipartisanship that would be necessary to exist where there are closer majorities didn't exist here. Some of that non-cooperation and partisanship has emerged out of rather contentious relationships with the teachers' unions and Republicans in the last decade or so. Now, about 10, 15 years ago, the teachers' unions were a much more significant player when there were Democratic majorities in both houses here. That's changed significantly. The number of teachers currently in the teachers' unions have declined markedly in the last 10 years. So that variable and the fear that Republicans once had over reprisals, et cetera, doesn't exist anymore. So I think they've been emboldened to not be as bipartisan or as cooperative or as amicable as we had all hoped. I agree with what Christine is saying. Then moving forward, I think it'd be best for everyone to not feel like this is zero sum. And I think it's been to our disadvantage because the issue by the other side has been viewed as zero sum. That if you advance choice, you're hurting the public schools. And I think we need to do all we can to show that that's not the case. And oftentimes goodwill, like gestures that Christine had alluded to, I think can help and go a long ways in making sure that doesn't happen.
So based on what both of you just described, what are some lessons that I guess the broader education choice movement or crowd can learn from Utah, from North Carolina? What should be the policy approaches, the tactics, the messaging moving forward so that it can continue to be made broadly popular in a way that will be resonant with more and more parents and voters throughout the country? What do we need to learn from what's happened thus far to enhance the effort of education choice moving forward?
I mean, something that was talked about earlier, just to reiterate, I mean, sort of shifting this culture of recentering parents, I think you first have to have that as a fundamental baseline to even understand why choice would make sense or would be a natural outgrowth. You know, if they are the drivers of education, even if they send their child to a public school, that perspective I think drives this and makes some of this make a lot more sense. And like we've said, I mean, every child is different. I don't want to force some other child to go to a school that I think is best for my kids, so it's going to be best for them. No, you know, that's a choice for them and their family, and they understand their talents and weaknesses and strengths and all those things. And so we ought not to have sort of this arrogance or hubris about I can also determine what works for them. So let's make the best options of all the options that exist and move from there.
Bob, what do you think are the lessons learned?
The lessons learned for me are that we really need to fundamentally reconceptualize what public education is. For the longest time, you know, it was the one-room schoolhouse, you know, and we went through industrialization, and it worked for a while. You know, but then a lot of things changed beginning in the 70s and so forth. And people looked at public schools to educate their kids. But what is education? If you brought in 10 people into this office right now, you'd get 10 different answers. Christine alluded to some of it before. Some people think it's, you know, skill development. Some people think it's trying to aid moral and social development. It's different things to different people. And I think that's good because we live in a democracy. That doesn't mean we can't have fundamentally shared principles that are infused in different types of schools. But I think what the reality is, what we really need to learn, is that public education should be different things. And it should be different things. And it can be, public education can be obtained at a private school. Public education can be obtained at a charter school. It can be obtained at an art school or at a school for the sciences and math. We have to break out of this one-size-fits-all notion that all students should be stamped with the same way academically. And I think that's kind of bursting forth, and we have to realize that that's been driven by parents, but parents want options, and they want options, you know, they want to be able to obtain access to the best school for their child. And oftentimes, they don't have it, and they feel desperate, and that's what's propelled choice. So we have to learn from that and really pay attention to that, because I think in the last 5 years, parents have been shouting.
In the minutes that we have left, I want to ask you, what is often my favorite, the magic wand question. But first, if there's anything we didn't get to that you want to make sure you have a chance to articulate, go ahead and shoehorn it into your answer to this last part. But if you could wave a magic wand and just have one big thing happen in the realm of education policy, either in North Carolina, in Utah, or elsewhere, or across the nation, what would be the one big thing? Bob, let's start with you and then close out with you, Christine.
Well, right now, with the passage of so many programs nationally, and even here in North Carolina, and with the numbers we're dealing with, I'd like to wave a magic wand and ensure successful implementation of these programs. What does that mean? That we have the seats available. I mean, that we have entrepreneurs coming into North Carolina to start building more schools, that we can meet demand, et cetera. Because there are going to be some growing pains with anything. And implementation is going to be the key. We've got to make sure that there aren't too many hiccups, that nothing's fatal, and that we can meet parental demand for new educational options.
Christine, your magic wand. Same thing, just good implementation, or what else is on the horizon in your mind for Utah and beyond?
Well, so if my jurisdiction is Utah, I would say enough funding to cover all the demand that is clearly there for the Utah Fits All scholarship. And I would have said universal education choice in every state, but Dr. Luebke was very wise in talking about implementation, because that really is the next step. You want it to work out well and actually have good outcomes for the students, and that we hear about it. And that's the ultimate goal, not just passing legislation. We hope that it gets implemented well and has good impacts for the students and carries on with success there. So that's what I would do.
Well, with that, we'll close there. Thank you both again for sharing your time and expertise and helping us kind of compare and contrast Utah and North Carolina and seeing what lessons we can learn for policymakers in both our states and in other states to continue to try and improve and reform the education system we have for the next generation. So thank you very much, both of you. Again, Bob Luebke, the director of the Center for Effective Education, the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina, and Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. Thanks for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to take one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there are a few key things that I captured from our discussion that I want to re-emphasize and underscore based on what Bob and Christine said in our discussion about education choice. And that's this. There are really, I think, three key principles that we can take away that we can use in our conversations. So if you find yourself in a discussion, or even if it feels a little bit more like a debate on the issue of education choice, here are the three things that I wrote down that I think we can remember. Number one, it's important that we articulate the need to recenter the discussion on the important role that parents play and the vital impact of parental involvement on education outcomes for their kids. And that means recognizing that parents are the ones who are chiefly responsible for directing how their kids are educated and how they learn. It's a really important piece that I think can help open the door to broader discussions about even the benefit or the need for education choice. It also leads to the second component, which is to emphasize this idea of the parent-teacher partnership, or a handshake, if you will, as we heard it described today. This idea that parents and teachers aren't supposed to be adversarial to one another, but should work together for directing the education and learning of kids in those schools and kids of those parents. And then the third option is, or the third aspect rather, is that we want to make sure we can articulate that school choice options and the traditional K-12 school system should also not be adversarial, but should be viewed as parts of a greater whole, that both of these things are worthy of being strengthened or worthy of support and can work together as part of a bigger, more vibrant education system to have more options so that more and more families, more and more kids can find the kind of education they need that works best for them. I think if we can weave in some of these talking points into our discussions, that'll help elevate this issue when we talk about it with friends and family or our elected officials. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. So grateful that you spent some time with us talking about the importance of education policy on this episode. If you liked what you heard, please visit defendingideas.org. You can access all of our episodes. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and hit subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, on the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, you can access all of that and more at defendingideas.org. We hope you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we talked about today. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.